I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. The 2025 Maryland General Assembly session ended April 7th. After a few days of rest, House Majority Leader David Moon and Maryland Association of Counties Executive Director Michael Anderson joined me to review the session and to look forward. There is talk of the Assembly returning for a fall session in October. Updated revenue numbers will decide. If the U.S. Congress goes ahead with Medicaid cuts, a fall session is likely inevitable. We have covered details of the budget plan in several back episodes, including breaking down expenditures and revenues. The official record, called the 90-day report, comes from the Department of Legislative Services and is now out. I will link in the show notes. Stay with us.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program, where you'll learn to shape public policy, impact communities, and function at the center of modern society. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning, precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from CatScan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C. Paul Chaperis on bass and vocals, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synths and percussion. Their latest album, reflecting the time and this cultural moment, is called Everything is Normal. To feel better, go see them live. You can find out where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. If you have difficulty finding them, we share their events on I Hate Politics socials. David Moon, Michael Sanderson, welcome back to I Hate Politics.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
David, when you were on the show just before the session started, the Maryland General Assembly session started for 2025, you had made a big case for economic growth. And Governor Moore had made a big case about economic growth as well, and has been making for some time. To what extent do you think this session addressed the issue of economic growth?
If you had asked me at the top of the session, way back in the winter, what I wanted the assembly to work on, it would have been 100% cost of living issues, affordability concerns, cost containment for ordinary Maryland residents. And a very close second to that would have been really trying to jumpstart and juice Maryland's economy, specifically the private sector, and trying to get us away from overly reliant on the federal government. But we quickly saw, with the almost loss of the $1 billion in Key Bridge funding, and that turned out to just be a tiny taste of the mayhem and chaos that was to come next. But all of that led me to scratch all of those aspirations and say, no, actually, we're here in survival mode. This is about radical and rugged, immediate self-reliance, having to immediately do as much as possible with as little as possible. And that did not allow us to maximize our opportunities to focus on cost containment or private sector enhancement.
Mike, from your point of view at the Maryland Association of Counties, what do you think happened with economic growth?
The federal presence has been a relative point of stability in our local economy. At the moment now, it feels like a relative point of weakness. And I agree that we sort of had to jump the tracks and play more defense than offense. I would point out, though, that the governor introduced and the legislature did pass a bill trying to refocus some of the state's efforts on economic development. The idea of you have an economic development office and a Department of Commerce and a similar framework in each county government, and sort of double down on some of the things that Maryland does well and try and lean into our future as a hub for technology and sort of advanced thinking and as a resource for the rest of the country. I think that's probably a smart bet to make on Maryland's behalf. If you want the next 10 or 30 years to have a tip up in the scale, I think those investments make some sense.
David, what are the things that you identify that would have contributed to economic growth that could not be done given the circumstances?
I'll start with our climate goals. Electric vehicles, for example. The governor just put out an executive order to pause our clean car penalties. This was a big topic during the discussion, but, underneath all of this, the Trump administration is withholding something like $330 million in electric vehicle charging infrastructure funds that the state had previously been awarded. And again, I could go across the board and start talking about how our ambitions on many things like that were cost dependent had to be tamped down. I think in the House this year, a fiscal note over $50,000 immediately generated a need for a discussion upstairs about whether we had the room for that in the budget.
In terms of climate goals, the Assembly did pass more natural gas plants for electricity generation. So it's not like this is entirely coming from the Trump administration.
The point is, if you have any ambitions and suddenly the federal government is against you on those ambitions, you're really far behind from where you started.
Sure, but was this unexpected?
No, some of it was. I mean, at the jump, I immediately said, well, I assume we can count on no federal support for the Baltimore Red Line. I mean, honestly, the EV infrastructure, that's not actually that surprising. I kind of figured they'd go after that. I kind of figured they'd go after DEI, maybe even USAID, international aid. But honestly, they're really pointing the finger at, things that are not anticipated. Like, really, you're going after food safety, food inspections, and drug approvals, and medical technology R&D, like stuff that really is the backbone of a lot of private sector. That's our tax base. USAID alone triggered 1,250 private sector contractor losses in Maryland in the first few weeks. And then a few weeks later, that triggered 1,000 job losses in Baltimore from Hopkins people working on research grants. That's 3,000 jobs of private sector people who got laid off in just 1 month, one agency, into the thousands. And again, you have to repeat that across NOAA, NIH, FDA, Social Security up at Woodlawn, Park Service at the CNO Canal, all the way up from, Cumberland. There's no part of this is Maryland's fault and part of this is Trump's fault. No, we actually had a fairly reasonable plan coming together at the beginning of the session.
Michael, the counties are also affected. In Montgomery County, County Executive Mark Elridge proposed a fairly novel idea, which is to say that he is proposing a tax increase, balancing off the federal and state tax cuts and service cuts. So do you think that's a feasible kind of reorganization of public finance in the state?
Most services that county governments deliver, we're the end of the line. We don't have anyone to shift to. We don't have a whole lot of places where we can just say, folks will do without. We'll just do without education this year. So for the most part, you've got to work it out at the county level. And I don't think Montgomery will be the only jurisdiction saying to make ends meet, to meet up with our education obligations and to cover some of the costs that the state has sent to counties, we may need to raise a tax here or there or extra charges just to get by.
So there is a small raise in the county tax ceiling.
Most counties have a flat rate income tax. 2/3 of Marylanders have been huddled right at the ceiling, at the state cap. The state said, bump up that cap from 3.2% to 3.3%. So it's not a monumental increase, but that change, could be enough for some jurisdictions to say, let's use that new tool so we can cover these costs.
The General Assembly failed to resolve the 287G immigration legislation. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was a Maryland resident. There was another Maryland resident, a woman in Frederick County, that was picked up. John McCarthy, Montgomery County State's attorney, has said that there is informal cooperation between ICE and Montgomery County, and other counties have a more formal cooperation. The failure of the legislation, how did it come about? What was the holdup? And how are you thinking about it now that the Trump administration is actually targeting specific Maryland residents?
We were working on getting an immigration deal done down to the wire. It literally almost all fell apart, and we almost walked away with nothing about 10 minutes to midnight, when literally it's an antiquated system. The paperwork got delivered, and we rushed to the floor, passage of some fairly modest bills that would have agencies come up with policies to prevent their data from being sold out to third parties, and to require a warrant if ICE wants to come into a so-called sensitive location like a school, a hospital, or a library, where you really want to minimize disruptions. But as you note and ask, the real big question was about these so-called ICE 287G agreements are essentially formal agreements that local police departments can enter into with ICE to become deputized to carry out various deportation functions, either in prisons or otherwise. And so we had a bill, and the House passed it, that would have ended those agreements. And the reason for it is, we started the session with 3 Maryland counties in these agreements, and now it's about 7, all red counties, obviously. And they have created a policy where anyone that gets picked up for an infraction is going to get run for an immigration check. Under these agreements, it could be anything, a very minor offense, a traffic offense even. Now you have a whole bunch of people who don't want to call the local police for help. And so say if you're a domestic violence victim, it's a terrible situation to put someone in. We voted in the House to rein those counties in and not allow these agreements to go forward any longer. But to placate the broader public safety concern, we also reined in the sanctuary counties. And we said every county will cooperate with violent criminal detainers and felons and gang members.
I want to particularly ask about Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who is not a gang member, was picked up in Maryland, is an apprentice in a union. Martin O'Malley has now suggested that the state file kidnapping charges. Are there ways in which to help specifically people that are being picked up? It is true, as John McCarthy has said, there are no big raids in Maryland yet, but specific people are being picked up. And then there are questions about whether they are, in fact, gang members or violent criminals.
Well, certainly we are now in an era of unusual solutions being needed for every problem. J.D. Vance early on said some strange things about expanding presidential powers and maybe ignoring court orders. And, we all started scratching our heads and thinking like, oh my God, is this where things are headed? The Senate president started talking about a constitutional crisis. I started conjuring weird bills, putting the liens on federal property once it seemed like they were headed in the direction of not paying their bills. Are these strange, unusual, and possibly themselves illegal solutions? The president seems intent on defying a Supreme Court order at the moment. Our Senator, Chris Van Hollen, bless him, is, talking about flying to El Salvador, to make a site visit and try and put pressure.
Michael, what is the variation among counties over this issue? And I particularly want to understand what the red counties think they are getting into.
A lot of jurisdictions, the sheriff is the chief law enforcement officer, and in many of them manages the detention center. So in many cases, this is a different political branch than the county commissioners or county council. Like in Frederick County, one of the jurisdictions that has one of these 287G agreements, that's an agreement with the elected sheriff. And I don't think that would pass muster if it were placed before that county's council and executive as, if there were a resolution or a bill before them, shall we, engage in this agreement with the federal government? I will say that we're in a new chapter of these relationships because we've never seen a federal administration administer as much pressure on local law enforcement and corrections as this one is. So if you run a jail, no matter what your political persuasion is or whatever you might think about the appropriate process for someone who may be here without full documentation, and now who's in your jail or in your criminal justice system for one reason or another, independent of that, you now have a stack of paperwork coming from federal ICE indicating you had better comply in the following ways, or you could lose the support you've been counting on from federal government that helps train and support the officers and programs that you have today. So pressure from the federal government to get on board, sign an agreement, work things out with ICE when we want to talk to one of your inmates, that is a new dimension here. And that's why there's been a tick upward in jurisdictions either signing the paperwork or saying, we'll collaborate in the following ways informally. So we've got more of that happening just because the feds are banging the table on it.
The General Assembly did pass energy bills. The new law will facilitate new natural gas generating plants. And that is detrimental to Maryland's climate goals, but will also take 7 years to build and then have no impact on electricity rates. How did we come to this place?
The totality of the package was a choice for gas. Many of the people who were working on this were trying to make it a bit more neutral than that, especially in terms of whether there'd be public subsidies for gas. The package overall did attempt to do some very modest relief in the short term by using some funds to pay down bills for a couple cycles, so people will start to see that show up on their rates. There was a very wild debate about preempting local zoning restrictions. It did ultimately land in a fairly modest policy, just a few percentage points of rural land. There is some preemption, again, to clear the way for some of these energy projects. There's a push towards battery storage and more solar, with some promises to do multiples more of clean energy projects for non-clean projects. The goal ultimately was to get more in-state generation as well as transmission opportunities to get us away from the situation where we're solely importing such a large amount of our energy.
I don't understand at all this imperative that you have to generate in-state. You can't control the electrons once you're part of the grid. You're part of a 13-state grid. It is supposed to be a market where energy is produced in one place and sold in another. You can't mandate electricity generated in Maryland to be sold in Maryland. It's not even possible.
Don't get into details with me because I'm not an expert on this. Just from the fly on the wall perspective that I could hear was about market signaling. It was all very indirect. So a lot of this is stab in the dark.
Michael, I think you did say that you clawed back some powers on behalf of counties with regard to siting of solar projects.
This has been a 5, 6, 8 year struggle. The Maryland courts have basically stepped in and said local governments are preempted in siting of big power plants, but all that law has basically been carried over to large-scale solar facilities. So, you drive down a highway on the Eastern Shore or into Western Maryland, and you see giant patches of solar and so forth. Those are sited basically without local input in what usually is the land use process. You go through zoning, you get approval, does it fit with the surrounding area, that sort of stuff. But decades ago, Maryland said those laws shouldn't apply for a new power plant because then you'd end up with every community saying no thanks. Now those laws more or less apply to setting up solar facilities. This year's bill, in what was an awkward compromise for a lot of stakeholders, did give local jurisdictions the ability to say, once we've reached a certain degree of our reserved agricultural area, our priority preservation area, you get to 5% of that area which gets occupied with clean energy solar facilities. Then at that point, you have a new ability to say, we've done our part, move on. We can reject a project that goes beyond that limit. And that has not existed before. I don't know who will be the first to get there, but we'll have some Eastern Shore jurisdictions who are trying to keep areas reserved as agricultural in character. We'll probably see some of those in the years ahead bump up against that 5% area.
Housing has similar issues. The governor's housing bills failed, in part because they sought to preempt local zoning. Maryland Association of Counties opposed those bills. What is the play there?
It's challenging every time a piece of statewide legislation is submitted and advanced to basically say, we should set the rules here in Annapolis that will apply to every town and every county and every area across the state. And we'll make decisions that are effectively zoning decisions without being in the neighborhood, without having the local input and guidance. We won't walk block by block. We'll just come up with some general principles. And you always end up with abrasive feedback there just because we do things differently. Here in Baltimore County, we have a 4-year comprehensive rezoning. You're not taking that into account in this statewide bill. And how could you? How could you consider every possible neighborhood circumstance?
David, I know you follow housing more than you follow energy.
This continues to be a disappointment of mine, housing policy. So I'm only going to speak for myself on this. I'm not speaking for the House or the caucus or anything. But look, when you're facing the kinds of ongoing out-year budget deficits and as I've noted, heavy constraints now on what we can do with cash, both because of those deficits and because the Trump administration, as I've noted, is really kicking the legs out of our economy. We just can't afford to, as Michael noted, throw hundreds of millions of dollars in discretionary funds to incubate companies or attract them or anything like that. We just don't have the cash. And so, as I've suggested many times, that if you're a state like us and you want to get private investment moving and you don't have the cash to do it yourself, but you're otherwise a highly desirable place for people to live. One easy place you can try and essentially deregulate to juice that private investment is housing. And we have so many examples of this, zoning changes that lead others to spend their own money to both solve a public problem, housing shortage, for the government, and do it in a way that adds to our tax base and creates jobs and economy while doing it. I mean, this is sort of crazy to me that we're even having this conversation. What options do we have? This is an honest question. I mean, and Michael knows, because I every time we have a legislative preview, I ask this of the counties. Look at our budget situation. Look at the fundamentals of Maryland's economy and look at our housing shortage. Why wouldn't we be pushing every lever right now to try and punch more housing onto the market and get more growth happening in our state? It's really strange to me that I understand why constituents are resistant to this, but policymakers, come on, this is government. What are we doing?
I think this issue always has layers to the onion. And I think the central argument you hear for why doesn't this particular project work in this particular location usually turns out to be about infrastructure, that we just don't have the pipes or we just don't have the seats in the schools to accommodate another 2,800 units in this middle school is going to turn, is going to do.
Michael, let me just pause there for a second, because every jurisdiction, Montgomery County, Howard, and Anne Arundel, that's looked at new apartments going online or whatever and looked specifically at these school capacity issues, has come to the conclusion that the school enrollment growth is not coming from the apartments. It's coming from single family homes turning over. People who without kids going on and selling or renting their single family home to people who bring kids into the school system. And that it really has nothing to do with any of the new construction. I represent district level constituents too, and my people really hate development. But again, from the policy fundamentals of this, I just don't see how we have a choice, both from the housing shortage and unless you've got cash at the county's levels that you guys can throw at the problem. Why aren't people want to bring their own money to bring houses here? It's like, let's let them do it.
And that suggests that every county or every jurisdiction in Maryland has a sign out front that says, please don't move here. And that's obviously not the case. We have tens of thousands of building permits in the state every year. And occasionally projects go sideways, a lot of them for reasons that have nothing to do with a local permit or local approval. The argument for this expands the county's tax base and gives you more activity that you can lean on to provide better service. I mean, it's in everybody's interest to have sensible growth in the places that you want it, in the places where you can handle it. And I think that's where you try and thread the needle.
Let me pick out a thread from the housing discussion to talk about education. The blueprint remains funded at levels that were in the past, but going forward, we have moved benchmarks. David, can you lead us through the blueprint discussion?
At the end of the day, what ended up happening was a deal was struck to basically spare any student-facing funds from the chopping block and instead to focus on a 2-year delay on some of the aspirations for teacher professionalization, teacher collaborative time. And that's where the bulk of the savings came into play. So for now, we're good, but we'll be back at this at some point. And on the general fund outside of the education budget, it seems like we may be back looking at it anyway if the revenue write-downs continue as they seem they're going to.
Yeah, I'm just afraid that we are back in Thornton territory with that.
Yeah.
As part of the changes to the blueprint and more generally to teachers' pensions and all of that, the state shifted burden to counties. Can you address that part of the education and more broadly about shifting spending burdens down?
As a practical matter, it's just one more challenge for county leaders who already have their own struggle. Education in particular, right now, is the driving force on what counties need to find in their own budgets. The blueprint is a 10-year plan, and depending on your arithmetic, we're in year 3 or 4, thereabouts, of a 10-year rollout. The state has basically an education trust fund that's been paying for its share of the plan, and it really hasn't landed on the general fund. It won't for a couple more years. Once it does, by the way, the state's general fund forecast goes from relatively balanced to $2 billion in the hole again. Number of jurisdictions this year already are pinched just to be able to meet their number for the blueprint. And each year of this rollout, the number of counties who are stressed by that is going to increase. Eventually, just living up to your share of the blueprint is going to be the driving part of the entire county budget in every jurisdiction. And where we see that as a hot point right now is, what if you have a local program in your schools that seems very effective and very popular? You've been doing teacher mentoring, or we have an outdoor learning program, or we have a gifted and talented students program, or things like that. Those are not required in the blueprint. They're not part of what the state says is essential for public education. So the state says, do all this. The state says we will fund it through our formula, which, by the way, was written in 2018 and doesn't include the growth in cost of living that's happened since then that nobody saw coming. So the state's funding an old formula amount. The county has to pick up the rest. And then the schools say, we're still short. We're going to be laying people off or getting rid of our mentoring program unless we get extra money on top from the county. I think we're going to see a lot of that in this spring. Like the next 6 or 8 weeks will be when the counties finish off their budgets. I think we will see combat between school systems and county governments over what's unaffordable in a school budget, even if the county does its full share under these state formulas.
I want to ask David whether you've thought of other areas that could benefit from deregulation apart from housing, to juice up the economy.
Oh, gosh. I mean, it's going to have to be done industry by industry and at the spot level. We have folks. I mean, some of it is regulatory reform, right? I mean, I know the governor was correctly focusing on permitting reform. So where we have permits, can we speed them up? And you can get very micro about this. I mean, when Governor Hogan first got here, we actually looked at something very simple like curb cut reform, which was state highway authorizing driveway cuts and things of that nature. You wouldn't think that was a big deal, except everyone from Governor O'Malley to local developers across the state were complaining that all of their projects, including big ones like National Harbor and what have you, were having months and months of delays for a silly curb cut permit. So I had a bill in my first year down here, and the Republicans actually put in a similar bill. And actually, Hogan ran with it and started something very simple like curb cut reform. But I think we're very long overdue for much more of a systematic overhaul of that sort of thing. And again, I just speak for myself on this because there are very ingrained ways of thinking in Annapolis on this. And so I in some ways, I'm alone. I'll give you another example. The Obama administration years ago used to look at occupational licensing and point to states that it thought were engaging in way too many occupational licenses. And in Maryland, we are way down the rabbit hole. We've got like music therapy licensing, blow drying licensing. There was something on the floor this year about like eyelash extension licenses or some such. So I kid you not, to become a barber, you got to do 1,500 hours in Maryland. So, hey, And then whole industry associations spring up, right? So there's whole legions of regulatory reform, deregulation, expediting and permitting reform that we could get into if we really wanted to juice some things there. But of course, I'm a Democrat, so we do all this balanced again, maintaining regulations for public safety, consumer protections, and the like. But there's a lot we can do.
Michael, you get the last word.
Every effort to green tape and say, let's do something that's common sense and quicker and smarter. Typically, you plant that flag and you have a public hearing, and then you have an hour's worth of testimony why that's a terrible idea and why curb cutting must be done in the old way, and a variety of folks who will resist change of almost any sort. And then there's the ideological difficulties as well. I mean, is Maryland going to back off on its own environmental regulations in the interest of building faster and more quickly? And a political balancing act is in the event that we're going to go out of cycle, and if the fiscal circumstances get dire enough that we need broad action on the budget or the budget plan, and it can't wait till January, is that going to be just a green light? Put in whatever bill you didn't get passed last year? Put in the housing bill again? Oh, well, what about I had a little bill about food deserts, and I wanted to change the cosmetologist licensing fee from $75 to $125 for this. I mean, surely you could have 600 bills introduced in a special session and go gangbusters.
Michael Sanderson, David Moon, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much. Always a pleasure.
That's Democrat David Moon, the Maryland House of Delegates Majority Leader, and Michael Sanderson, the longtime executive director of one of the most powerful bodies in the state, the Maryland Association of Counties, which somehow keeps red and blue jurisdictions together. Now that Annapolis is done, the scene shifts to the counties as they work through their budgets, and we will continue to bring you explanations, perspectives, and the latest updates. Music for this episode comes from CatScan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C., Paul Chaparas on bass and vocals, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synths and percussion. Their latest album reflecting the time and this cultural moment is called Everything is Normal. To feel better, go see them live. You can find out where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. If you have difficulty finding them, we share their events on I Hate Politics socials. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.